Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for this exciting talk on the Frankie Howerd and the Frankie Howerd archive. It's really good that so many of you have been able to join us. To start off with introductions, I am Gary Brannan, and I am in the fortunate position to be Keeper of Archives and Special Collections here at the University of York. And just one of the archives that we are very lucky to care for since last year is the archive of Frankie Howerd. And that's the subject of tonight's talk. Just go through a few technical notes first, if that's okay. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those questions can be submitted at any point during tonight's session, but we'll be taking questions a little bit later on. Should you have any technical issues at home, should you lose your Wi-Fi and drop out of the session, you can rejoin at any time you like using the original link before 9 p.m, obviously. And please do remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch this again. And I'm sure you'll want to, because it's going to be very enjoyable. If you would like to have subtitles, if you just look at the bottom of your screen, we have those available for this event. It's live transcription. It's a live transcript. Don't be surprised sometimes if some words don't come out okay, but they are there for you. You can turn these on or off using the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom of your screen. Okay, well, we might as well get ourselves going. I'll provide that little bit of context first as to one of the reasons we are here tonight. So last year, 2021, we received an unexpected email out of the blue asking us if we are interested in the archive of Frankie Howerd. Many of you might know this already. Frankie was born in York. In fact, his house is just over that way, where I'm sat now in the Borthwick. And we were absolutely thrilled to take part and working with Neil Pearson-Rebux in the acquisition of the archive. And it now sits safely here in York. It arrived in June last year, so it's just been with us for 12 months, with a significant new addition arriving just over 2 weeks ago. And later on in tonight's session, we will hopefully be harnessing the power of modern technology to allow you to see some elements from the archive, many of which have not been seen before and will be being seen for the first time. What's in the archive? Well, we'll come to that a little bit later. I'll leave that as a tease. But we've got original scripts, correspondence and contracts spanning the whole of Frankie's career. But first of all, here to talk to us tonight, and we're very pleased to have him here, is Graham McCann, who you can probably see on your screen there. Graham is Britain's leading writer about film and television, with a very long list of publications to his name. Written 4 biographies for Fourth Estate, Cary Grant, A Class Apart, Morecambe and Wise, Dad's Army, the story of a classic television show, and the subject that brings him here for us tonight, Frankie Howerd. Graham, I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to talk to us about this wonderful treasure trove of rare and unseen items in the style of Frankie. That is the end of the prologue. Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you to everyone at York for organising this and inviting me to it, and hello to everyone watching. It's a fascinating and really valuable and worthwhile archive because of the depth and breadth of Frankie Howerd's career. He was born in 1917 in York, and he died in 1992 in London. And he had a career that spanned 5 decades, involving so many great events and so many crises. I think it was the most important and indeed revolutionary stand-up that this country has ever produced, because he changed the very idea of the relationship between the stand-up and an audience. Before him, they were turns. Afterwards, they were one of us. They were real people we could identify with. He brought in intimacy, a sense of imagination, a sense of colour, a sense of believability, a sense of vulnerability that hadn't been there before and now is commonplace. And that's a sign of the extraordinary legacy that he left. Really, just about all comedians today in Britain owe a huge debt to Frankie Howerd, and they're really, whether they know it or not, are following in his footsteps. And the wonderful thing about this archive is that, as I said, it does cover the full range. If you think about his remarkable career, the late 1940s, he was a appearing once a fortnight on Variety Bandbox on the radio to more than half of the United Kingdom, and very rapidly became Britain's most popular comedian. Then into the 1950s, he was one of the pioneers of what became bona fide TV comedy with the Howard crowd. Then into the 1960s, he helped to popularize political satire for the mainstream via his appearances on That Was the Week That Was, and then his residency at Peter Cook's Establishment Club. Then he went on to reinvent himself to some extent as a star of musical comedy in the West End, as the central character in A Funny Thing Happened to Me on the Way to the Forum. During the same kind of period, he starred in two wonderful series of sketch comedy and stand-up written for him by Galton and Simpson called The Frankie Howerd Show, which I think remains one of the most significant and impressive works of stand-up that we've ever seen. Then at the end of the decade, he went on to star yet again in another huge show at Pompeii. And then right the way through to the 70s and 80s and up to his crowning reappearance yet again as the doyen of the student community when he recorded his famous stand-up show at the Oxford Union Society. So it's a remarkable career and it covers so many areas. And I think that's why it's such a treasure trove for anyone, not just interested in Frankie Howerd, but also to some extent anyone who's interested in comedy of that era, both in Britain and to some extent internationally as well. What occurred to me when I was thinking of the short time we've got for me to cover, I reflected on the fact that probably most of you watching know a great deal about Frankie Howerd already, and you already know his famous highs when the titters were plentiful, and also his infamous lows when the titters were not. So I thought rather than maybe go over some of that material again, which is quite overfamiliar to some of you, I can simply say just about whatever you're interested in, whatever you know about Frankie Howerd and you might want to explore, is almost certainly in the archive with wonderful paper details, contracts, correspondence, annotated notes, and so on and so forth, which is wonderful for anyone curious or involved in research on Frankie Howerd and the various shows and productions with which he was associated. What I thought I'd rather do today in terms of touching on these themes is to give you a sense of some of the variety there that you might not be familiar with, some of the shows and projects and ambitions that were not so well publicized, but it gives you a sense of the wonderful secrets and surprises that are lurking in the archive. One of those themes is the idea of strange but significant relationships that Frankie Howerd had professionally. He met all kinds of people. I mean, Bette Davis, for example, used to meet him, give him advice on how to heat the teapot to put his toupee in place. Lauren Bacall, Cary Grant, Ray Milland, lots of Hollywood stars were big fans and friends of Frankie Howerd. But in terms of professional relationships, there are a number of ones that make you think that's quite strange, but they were nonetheless significant in his career. One of those that I thought I'd talk about briefly was Frankie Howerd and the Bee Gees. Now, this relationship, unconventional and surprising though it might seem, was regarded at the time as mutually beneficial. The Bee Gees were drawn to Frankie Howerd because he opened up to them a mainstream non-pop music, an older audience when they wanted to branch out. And Frankie Howerd saw the Bee Gees as a way to tap into a younger audience and an international one. And it lasted from the mid-60s, really all the way through the 70s. And it was very eventful, marked by all kinds of crises and innovations and ambitions, and certainly affected both of them in ways that they regarded as memorable. How did it start? It started in 1967 when the Australian music impresario Robert Stigwood came to be involved with the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein. Stigwood had come over to Britain from Australia in the mid-50s. He'd started to develop a career as a manager and promoter of music acts. By the mid-60s, he was pretty important in his own right. He was manager of Cream and involved with The Who and a whole number of other acts. And Brian Epstein, who was looking to stand back from music management by that point, saw him as a kindred spirit who might be able to take over many of his responsibilities at the times. So he encouraged him to invest in Epstein's company, NEMS, which was North End Music Stores, which had all kinds of musical interests, including, of course, most famously, the Beatles. However, his plan to let Stigwood take over was undermined to a great extent by the Beatles, who took an instant dislike to Robert Stigwood and basically said to Brian Epstein, if he takes over, all we'll do for the rest of our contract are multiple versions of God Save the Queen, all of them out of tune. It's your choice. So basically, Epstein had to go back and say, you can do everything but the Beatles. And then, tragically, in the summer of 67, Epstein died. Stigwood pondered for a moment the idea of taking on the Beatles and taking over NEMS, thought better of it. And by the end of 67, he decided to go out on his own and form the Robert Stigwood Organisation. And he had huge ambitions for this. It's going to be multimedia, not just music, films, television, theatre. And one of his first aims to feed that ambition was to try to get as much in-house talent as possible. And writers became a big part of that. And he noticed there was one very nearby in London, Associated London Scripts. Associated London Scripts really owed its existence partly to Frankie Howerd. Howerd was one of the greatest patron of comedy writers in Britain. He started out in the 40s just with Eric Sykes, but he was always looking to nurture the careers of anyone who showed any kind of promise. With that view, he founded in 1950 Frankie Howerd Scripts Limited, just for Eric Sykes and him, but they began to draft in others. Then when Eric Sykes got friendly with Spike Milligan, and both of them then in turn got friendly with the younger team of Galton and Simpson, they got more ambitious and decided to organise a writers' cooperative, which basically morphed from Frankie Howerd Scripts to Associated London Scripts in 1954 at 130 Uxbridge Road in London, above a greengrocer's shop. This rapidly became a magnet for all young writers at the time. They all flocked there. Johnny Spate followed, Terry Nation, later known as Doctor Who, of course, came there, Marty Feldman, Barry Took, Dick Barry, lots and lots of writers. And by the mid-1960s, it basically had a monopoly in terms of comedy writing. Any big comedy show on TV or on radio at that time probably came from Associated London Scripts. And so Stigwood knew if he got hold of them, he could drive all of his other projects. And so he basically merged them into Robert Stigwood Organisation. That made Frankie Howerd a shareholder of the Stigwood Organisation as well. Now, one of the first projects that Stigwood had was to make bigger and bigger stars of his compatriots from Australia, the Bee Gees. They were still in their teens. They'd only just come over. He'd signed them when he was at NEMS, took them with him to RSO, Robert Stigwood Organisation, and was now looking to make them branch out into mainstream entertainment, TV and movies. And he saw Associated London Scripts as the ideal way of writing their material. He also saw, as one of their directors, Frankie Howerd, the ideal friendly, popular patron who could introduce them to this broader crowd. And so he brought them together. They got on very well. And one of the first projects that he did was to get Frankie Howerd to host a TV special for them, which went out in August 1968, called Frankie Howerd Meets the Bee Gees, which introduces them basically to his audience. And that was written by Galton and Simpson, Associated London Script Project. But while that was going on, Stigwood went to Associated London Scripts and basically sent a memo to everyone's desk there saying, think of ideas for the Bee Gees and Frankie Howerd, movie ideas, TV ideas. And so everyone started brainstorming at that point in time. They came up with a comedy western for them. They came up with a kind of Hard Day's Night music satire about them. But Johnny Speight was the one who came up with the first concrete idea. He wanted to take his controversial play called If There Weren't Any Blacks, You'd Have to Invent Them, about race relations, obviously. And he rewrote it for Frankie Howerd and the Bee Gees, improbable though that might sound. And they were both keen on doing it until they suddenly got cold feet and told him to think of something else. Then he goes back to the drawing board and he comes up with, of all things, a Boer War comedy called Lord Kitchener's Little Drummer Boys. And both Howerd and the Bee Gees actually liked it. And the idea got greenlit by Robert Stigwood. Johnny Speight wrote the script, the screenplay, which is in the archive. Robert Stigwood raised about £1.5 million to fund it, which was a fair sum in those days. A production team was assembled. They even got as far as choosing location shoots in South Africa for it. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, one evening, Robert Stigwood opened his house, his door to his house, and found Barry Gibb there looking rather forlorn, saying he'd suddenly decided he didn't like the idea. He also didn't like the idea of doing any movies with his brothers and declared the whole thing a bore, and then he went off. And that left Stigwood pretty irritated and the other brothers very angry, and the project collapsed. Stigwood, brooding about this, goes off to America on business, and he's sitting in a hotel room in Los Angeles, turns on the TV and sees a new sketch show called Rowan and Martin's Laughing. And it's already a phenomenon in America. And it draws Stigwood in because, for one thing, it's fast, it's fresh, it's populist. It was very successful, but also a bit of research showed him it was appealing very much to a younger audience, the audience that basically bought Bee Gees records, amongst others. So he goes back to England, tells the Bee Gees and Howerd about it and says, what about us making the British version? And so the Bee Gees and Frankie Howerd agreed that the Bee Gees would basically star with him in the British version of Rowan and Martin's Laughing, 13 episodes as a first series. That, as a plan, Stigwood was going to use, obviously, Associated London Scripts writers to replicate the huge team that Rowan and Martin had in America. Then a bombshell was dropped on him by the fact that the Bee Gees turned up and said, actually, we've got two ideas. First one was, we don't want to use those writers, we'll write it ourselves, even though they were still in their teens at the time and had no background at all in terms of writing comedy. Once Stigwood's eyebrows gradually came back down his head, he was so besotted with them that he said, yes, okay, you can do that. Then the eyebrows shot back up when Barry Gibb announced that what they wanted to do was Laughing, but set in Tudor England. The whole thing would be set in Tudor England, using sketches as allegories about modern life. Once he calmed down, he decided to let them do that. And so perversely, they go off, told Frankie Howerd about it. He was rather bemused about the whole thing, but he cleared his schedule for it. And they started writing the project. And the pilot episode was basically going to feature Frankie Howerd as an ailing king on his deathbed with his three sons as princes looking after various parts of his kingdom. And then they would squabble over rule of them once the king expired. However, almost immediately with this project, it went very Spinal Tap and very shambolic. First problem was, at the end of 1968, Robin Gibb flounced off and decided that he wasn't getting enough of his songs released as singles, so he left the group. That left the other two Bee Gees basically to rewrite the script. And so now its second draft, it was going to be Frankie Howerd and two princes, Maurice and Barry Gibb. Then things went from bad to worse. Maurice Gibb was becoming deeply intoxicated in more ways than one with the trappings of his newfound fame. He married the singer Lulu, started going to more and more clubs, started drinking very heavily. He bought a new Rolls Royce and immediately smashed it up in Belgravia, flew through the windscreen. He was patched up in hospital, released. A few weeks after that, drank a couple of bottles of brandy, went to visit Stigwood at his offices in London, and promptly fell down a flight of stairs and broke one of his arms. And so by this time, Barry decided he'd have to rewrite the script again to basically push most of the action onto Frankie Howerd and himself and give Morris as little to do as possible. Then they finally started filming in August 1969 at Robert Stigwood's mansion in Middlesex. But things got even more chaotic. Maurice Gibb decided he wanted Lulu in it. And so, although it was still based in Tudor times, for no reason at all, Lulu pops up to sing Simon and Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson, or Mrs. Robinson as she pronounces it. And she sings it whilst casually polishing random bits of wooden furniture. And there are all kinds of bizarre sketches, a tennis match in chainmail and armor, Morris and Barry as birds in a tree, all kinds of strange things like that. Stevie Winwood and Blind Faith are stuck in there, really because Robert Stigwood wanted to promote them. The whole thing was a terrible mess, but they finished, and Stigwood immediately pronounced himself happy with it, rather bizarrely, starts telling the press it's going to be just as good as the American Laugh-In, tries to sell it to lots of people. In the meantime, Barry Gibb, by the end of that year, announces he's fed up with the whole thing and the Bee Gees, and he leaves. And so by that time, the Bee Gees are just down to Morris, and he's not even aware of it. And so Cucumber Castle, as the pilot had come to be called, was put on the shelf, and everyone got on with other things. Frankie Howerd was particularly irritated by this time because he'd arranged all kinds of promotional appearances in America to promote the project, and he'd had to desperately revise them because there was nothing really to talk about. And then by April 1970, suddenly the brothers decided they liked each other again. They rejoined, pondered for a minute reshooting bits of Cucumber Castle so Robin could get involved. In the end, decided they were bored with the whole thing, told Frankie who had to go off and do other things. And Robert Stigwood reluctantly had to re-edit the whole thing as a TV movie. And it was finally shown on Boxing Day 1970 on BBC Two just after lunch. And the whole project died a very sad death at that point in time. However, Howerd and the Bee Gees weren't finished. As the 70s came on, their careers started to soar again, just as Frankie's started to sag again. So he was quite delighted in 1977 when he was asked by Stigwood and the Bee Gees whether he'd join them for another project. This time it was going to be a huge budget international movie musical based on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Howerd was going to play Mean Mr. Mustard. This did go ahead, and they did do it, and it was famously an absolute disaster. It harmed the careers of just about everyone in it. It diminished the popularity of the Bee Gees for a time, and perversely, the only one who escaped with relative good plaudits was Frankie Howerd. He got the best reviews of his life in North America for it. In fact, they said he stole the show. So that was a remarkable turnaround, and it really represented the summation of his relationship with the Bee Gees. But this whole period, very eventful as it was, is there in the archive, a paper chase you can follow to show all of these things. And it shows you the kind of projects that are there that have largely not been discussed publicly, but are waiting really for people to explore. Another thing that you can see in the archive are the things that Howerd got up to when he seemed to have disappeared from public view in the fallow periods in his career, such as the mid-1970s. One of these periods there was he was feeling eclipsed by other younger performers in Britain, and he felt taken for granted. And so he started to look broader afield to Canada and Australia, for example. And one of the things the correspondence in the archive shows very well is that he wasn't at all afraid in those kinds of periods to just write to people to say, give me a job. And so he wrote to one of the bosses in CBC, the Canadian broadcasters, saying, will you let me do a sitcom? Which eventually happened, and it became Ooh Canada. Then it was renamed The Frankie Howerd Show. That got quite good credits, but they didn't renew it. And he also, around about the same time, developed, with help from David Frost, an Australian sitcom called Up the Convicts, which didn't do so well and was spaced out over a year with only 4 episodes, which really led him to go cap in hand back to Britain to try and resuscitate his career again. Then he became obsessed, rather perversely, with becoming a game show host, because lots of comedians were going into that kind of genre at that kind of point to get a new, fresh boost to their career, most famously Bruce Forsyth in the Generation Game. And the archive shows you the fascinating attempts by Frankie Howerd to try to reinvent himself implausibly as a game show host, even though he really lacked the discipline and the personality and the technical ability to do so. He begged Bill Cotton at the BBC to let him take over the Generation Game, was infuriated when Larry Grayson took over, but he didn't give up. He went back to record not 1, but 2 different pilots for the British version of the American show, The Gong Show, firstly for ITV and later, almost a decade later, for Channel 4. And they were deeply shambolic affairs. One is available on DVD, and there is a videotape, an unedited videotape in the archive of one of them as well. And that shows the kinds of things that he went through at that point in time and the doggedness with which he tried to go back. Just to note briefly some of the tantalizing what could have beens, which are also covered in the archive. For example, he could have become a fixture in the trend for comedy horror movies at the beginning of the 1970s. There is in the archive correspondence and a screenplay sent by Robert Bloch asking Frankie Howerd to appear in a segment of The House That Dripped Blood, but Howerd turned it down. He was also sent the script of Dr. Phibbs' Rises Again. And he thought more carefully about this one. The screenplay is again in the archive, but eventually he turned that down. He wasn't averse to the genre, as you can see from the material about the movie he did make in 1973, The House on Nightmare Park. Then there's other really tantalizing things. For example, there was a screenplay written expressly for him by Galton and Simpson called Not Tonight, Caligula, which was broadly a kind of continuation of the theme of Up Pompeii in an attempt to resuscitate his career at another quiet period. And that just didn't get funding to go ahead. Then there's a really fascinating project that went from the 60s through to the end of the 70s with the great filmmaker Michael Powell. And Michael Powell had a passion for years and years to make the movie adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. And he contacted Howerd about it initially in the late 60s and kept in touch. And they went back and forth, as you can follow again in the material that's in the archive. By the beginning of the 1970s, Powell told Howerd that he'd managed to get James Mason to agree to appear as Prospero and Mia Farrow to appear as Ariel. And he wanted Howerd to star as the cowardly jester Trinculo. And this went back and forth between them for really a good decade, with Powell just failing ultimately to get enough funding to realize it. But it was a project that was on the back burner that continued to excite Howerd at various points throughout the 1970s. And then finally, briefly, to mention, one of the later passions of Frankie Howerd was to find a niche for himself in that genre of cozy murder mystery, ideally with a kind of religious context. He'd really had this for a long time. He was a bit jealous of Margaret Rutherford getting that job as in Agatha Christie's Mrs. Marple movies. And he really wanted something like that with a male equivalent for him. Partly that came from his religious upbringing. He'd always been interested in the church. He toyed even with going into it before going into show business. He was also loved the G.K. Chesterton, Father Brown short stories. And he continued to read on theology and took it very seriously. And he loved the whole physical context of churches and churchyards. He used to walk around them saying his lines out loud, sometimes to the consternation of passers-by, to practice his lines. But he really wanted to find a religious murder mystery to suit him. And he had multiple attempts at that. For example, he got the Scottish writer Kenneth MacLeish to come up with a screenplay called Vice in the Vicarage, which ultimately didn't get funding to go ahead. But Frankie Howerd really liked that. And again, that's in the archive. And then very seriously, in the last few years of his life, the last 2 or 3 years of his life, he collaborated with Jeremy Burnham, who was a prolific dramatist writer, written for The Avengers and lots of other shows like that, to write a potential series called Holy J.O. And this was a murder mystery comedy series which featured the character of Jocelyn Oscar Spottiswoode, who was a country vicar who, surprise, surprise, in his spare time was obliged to become a crime solver, a murder mystery solver. And Burnham got as far as writing a sample script for it, and they were still discussing that right up to Howard's eventual physical collapse and ultimately his death. But it was the last thing that really excited him and was a real passion right up to the end of his career. And that's the kind of project, along with all of those other unresolved or partially resolved ones, that are there amongst all of the famous works and projects on Frankie Howerd in this incredible archive. And it's there for you to explore, not just to study Frankie Howerd and not just to study Frankie Howerd's great shows and great career, but also because of the nature of how many people he worked with and how many people he interconnected with in terms of writers, actors, producers, celebrities, and so on and so on. You don't just, in effect, get all of this material on Frankie Howerd, but you also get an extraordinarily rich and vivid shot of an entire era in terms of popular entertainment, both in Britain and also to some extent internationally. And it's all there in the Frankie Howerd archive, which makes me really keen to thank everyone involved for making it possible, and to Gary and all of his colleagues for organising it and continuing to promote it so well. And it's a real treasure trove for everyone who's waiting to access it and explore it. And there's so many stories waiting to be told or retold in that wonderful archive. So thank you, and back to Gary.
Graham, thank you. That's an absolutely fantastic tour through just some of the bits that you'll be able to see in the archive, and so many things I've learned. What I'm just going to do for a couple of minutes, we'll just put a few bits on screen so you can actually see bits of what's in the archive. While we're doing that, if you want to start putting some questions in, please do. I can see some of you have been lining those questions up. I'll be coming to those in just a minute, but we'll give Graham a chance to get his breath back there after a fantastic tour through the, should we just call it the B roads of the Frankie Howerd Atlas, really? It's some interesting, really interesting parts to it. We've mentioned some of the big hits. Now, I'm going to attempt to harness technology. We have an overhead camera here that I'm going to try and deploy to show you some of these bits. And we all know you should never work with technology, children, or animals. So we're going to have a go at this. If it fails miserably, at least we tried. Okay, so just bear with me, everybody. 1 minute, everybody, while I switch the camera. Hey, it appears like it is working. So we mentioned some of Frankie Howerd's bigger hits. Now, we've gone through some of the bits we may not have known about, but I'd feel a little bit awkward if we didn't show one of the things that some people may had seen themselves. Now, I will say right now, this is a script, I'm going to say the title of it was not what you would call this film today, but soon as you may end up recognising it. This is the original script for What We Can, Carry On Up the Jungle. And wasn't until I actually saw the original script that the penny dropped with me that, of course, the film is supposed to be a parody of Tarzan. I assume there were rights issues. But here we have Frankie's original personal copy of the script, and then we have the opening to Carry On Up the Jungle, which many of you might remember. If those of you who've seen it, you remember it starts with Professor Inigo Tenkel giving his talk on, I think it's on the Uslan bird, isn't it? Well, here we have the original script for it, and just as an illustration of exactly what Graham was saying, you can see in the archive how these things change, because you can notice there's a small annotation in pen there where they redate the film from 1873 through to 1900. And one of, taking my own personal reflections on the archive, one of those times you really do pinch yourself when you start to see those things you had seen on screen come to life again from the page. And quite a few scenes, as you go further down the script, you can see bits of it you may think you remember. When you compare it with the actual film itself, they're not actually in there, which is one of those bits that struck me, and something that you know so well, shedding a new light on it. Now, talking of shedding a new light on things we know so well, we've briefly mentioned Up Pompeii, and we've talked about, Graham's talked really interestingly about Frankie's time in Canada. Of course, Canada wasn't one of the first places he'd want to work, so what we're going to show you here is this, and it may well reflect quite a bit on the screen, because it's a gold cover for a script that you can see there. It's called The Pompeii Way. This was the American an American version of Up Pompeii. Frankie starred in it. As we understand, it has never been seen. It's apparently locked away in a vault somewhere in the US. What you can also see, you may have seen it as I was putting it under the camera, this copy belonged to Dennis Hamer, who was Frankie's partner. So we have the script here for the American version of Up Pompeii. If you want one of those moments, this is the first time I think anyone's going to have seen much of this. So if you open the cover, brace yourselves. There we go. And here we can see the cast. For those of you that do know your Up Pompeii, you can see that Frankie Howerd's character has been renamed in this particular production. So there's Fracas now. We have here the American version of Up Pompeii. You can see it is Frankie's copy. You can see where we've had lines edited. And this is one of the things that the archive is able to show us, is how these things change from the script through to the screen. The in-depth and sometimes I imagine quite frantic process of bringing something back to life. And one of these, a rare moment here, of course, where Frankie appears to have edited out one of his lines, which often didn't happen. So Graham mentioned about the game show ideas. Well, we have one of those game show ideas here. Now, this is one of these unproduced shows. We found several copies of this in the archive. It was obviously put out for wide distribution. So here we have a version, something called the Frankie Howerd Game Show, and it's very much a format. I'll briefly let you have a look at it, but it is one of the strangest things you will ever see. It's from 1980, so this post-dates Frankie's effort to get himself on the Generation game. And here we have a game show that has been put together to really try and give Frank a base to do what he does best, which is they put gossip to complain about everyone and everything. He'll have playing upon parts of his existing act. You see an assistant who's slightly deaf, a couple of hostesses or cashiers. It appears to be kind of set partly in a shop. And then what we do get to is some games that are very, very unusual. When I first looked at this, my feeling was this is almost like, you can see the games here now at the bottom, kind of bit like these task-based games. So we have a game here, they will all be very silly. You've got Odd Man Out, which is two 6-footers and a man 4 feet odd, and they have to guess which one is called Brian. And the silhouette of a man and the lady has to guess who it is, and it turns out to be a husband. I think you might be able to see why this one wasn't picked up as a final format. There are loads of others in here. There's a great one I'll very quickly show you about Frankie Howerd's attempts to a game show. This comes from much later. in his career. This comes from 1991, so really not too long before Frankie passed away. But it's a format that's called Plaza, which is a general knowledge knockout quiz played in 2 parts by 3 couples. This is a serious format. It's commented on by Frankie in September 1991. He did meet up with the producers while he was on the Des O'Connor show to discuss it in more detail. It must be down at Thames for the night. He liked the idea because there was a lot of ad-libbing potential in it, but they were a little bit worried they didn't see anything particularly Frankie Howerd in it. So what you got here is that the general concept of a 2-part game. Again, it's set in a shot. You can hopefully you can see it bleeding through from the page in front. But here we have the set design or the concept for the set for Plaza. So a big 3-level game show that would be hosted by Frankie Howerd, a really big, expensive entertainment format that was designed, they hoped, to take the best advantage of Frankie's performance style. These are the things we can get to, and these are the things we can easily read. There are other things in the archive that are tantalising in what they may contain. In the recent edition of material, a couple of weeks ago, there were a large number of cassette tapes that came in, some of which we think have been seen are available commercially, some we think really do warrant further investigation. Graham mentioned Up the Convicts. Here we have what appears to be a broadcast cassette for Up the Convicts. The cassette is in there. Thankfully, we do check these kind of things. There we have the tantalising cassette of one of the episodes of Up the Convicts. We also have similar ones for the shows in Canada as well. We also have many challenges as an archive, one of which is the kind of video format. So the one I just showed you there was a U-matic. We also get some very difficult formats, such as this one. I don't know if anyone in the audience remembers the video cassette format, but there's a production on here that no one really knows too much about called Up the Alps. And we're going to be working over the next few months, hopefully, in getting this item digitized so we can see what it is. That really is just scratching the surface of some of the stuff that's in the archive. Graham mentioned there's a lot of contracts. I'll just very briefly show you one of the contract files. There we have a file of Frankie Howerd's contracts. And the one I'll open it up to is the one we mentioned for the performances in Australia. And here we have, hopefully you can see, the contractual arrangements for Frankie's visit to Australia in 1975 to film the sitcoms in Australia. And there's a lot of it in the archive. There's a lot of these correspondence and contract files. And in the very recent edition, there's also collections of fan mail as well, which are a riveting read and show a very different side of Frankie in terms of how he related to his fans. And there are some where there are some real long runs of ongoing correspondence between Frankie and people who were fans of his, some of which obviously are people that you'd know as well. Okay, I can see that people have been putting questions in, and I really want to get to those, so I will stop sharing my screen and get back to the chat. So, Graham, are you okay to answer just a few questions from the audience? We've got quite a few in, so we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Sure, yes.
Sure. Okay. We've got a question here from Amanda, which was asking about what relationship was between Frankie Howerd and Larry Grayson, as they seem to be competing for the same socio-comedic space.
Yes. Well, there's no diplomatic way of putting it. He hated Larry Grayson. Larry Grayson, as far as I know, didn't have any great antipathy towards Frankie, but they sort of bypassed each other. While Frankie was a huge star in the 50s and 60s, Larry Grayson was working the clubs. By the way, if anyone's interested in Larry Grayson, it's a tremendous new biography of him, which is around at the moment, which is well worth looking at. When Larry Grayson, was sort of popularized at the beginning of the 70s by Michael Grade, his agent, he started to get lots and lots of shows. Basically, Frank Howerd decided they should have been his shows. He got it into his head that the bosses had decided there was only room for one camp comedian, and he'd been usurped by Larry Grayson. What made it worse was he felt, with some justification, that Larry Grayson had basically either consciously or unconsciously borrowed his act from the deaf pianist to complaining about someone off screen who was irritating him, talking about what a terrible week he'd had, all of his infirmities, all of those kinds of things. And so he sat there watching Larry Grayson getting angrier and angrier, thinking, I'm not working, I can't do my act. What makes it worse is someone else is doing my act and I'm having to sit and watch it. So lots of comedians, including, of course, the much missed other great Yorkshireman Barry Cryer, told me that he went to dinner sometimes with Howard and he made the mistake once of saying, what do you think about Larry Grayson? And he regretted it deeply because Frankie Howerd was banging the table and saying he stole my act. And he stole my work, and he never asked him again. So it was lingering resentment, I think, from Frankie Howerd's end. It was one-sided, but he was quite bitter about it.
Oh. Just mentioning Barry Cryer there, we've got a question that includes the late Barry Cryer. So this is a question from Jane, who says that people like Barry Cryer say that they wrote the script with all Frankie Howerd's typical phrases included, but did Howerd actually do much ad-libbing?
No, he didn't. No, he would. You could sort of say he did ad-libbing when he was preparing, but he hated the idea when he was on stage. He was a nervous wreck, and later on he had to take uppers and downers to meet some kind of medium to let him get through a show. He was very nervous. He hated the idea of ad-libbing, but he used to be quite mischievous with his writers. If they didn't put in the oohs and ahs and ums, he'd say, where are these things? Where's the oohs and ahs? And then the next time they do it, and he'd go, don't put those in, I'll put those in. So he used to play around with it a bit, but it depended how well the writers knew him. If they knew him like Goldman Simpson, Eric Sykes, they'd write it and he'd basically say it like that. If they were less familiar, like younger writers like Gran Marks or something, I think he would try to get a basic, quite cold script and then work it up himself. But it did vary. But once he got it, as the archive will show, he didn't keep it in pristine condition. He'd scribble all over it. He'd add his own annotations. He'd underline things, sometimes use coloured pens, and he'd get all of his oohs and ahs and things like that in at that stage. But once it was finished and he was going to perform, he didn't like to deviate at all.
Yeah. And we have actually got a picture in the archive of him doing his legendary rehearsing with cows as well in a field. Yes. Did he read? Was that a thing, or was that just something he did for television?
No, he really did. He used to love doing that. He was very nervous, so he had to walk around going through the script in his head, checking that he could memorize it, and then he'd check again to get the rhythms, and then he'd check again to think about how to pause for laughs. And he would do it any kind of relatively quiet area. So it might be a churchyard, it might be a cemetery, it might be a field. And so if a cow happened to be there, they'd get their own special first performance of the forthcoming show.
That's fascinating. Look, in some ways, and something I can say properly, lucky cows, quite often. We've got a question from Keith, who says, was Frankie involved in entertainment when he was in the services? For instance, was he an ensign?
No, he wasn't. He eventually got a kind of foothold into the forces troop team called Stars in Their Battle Dress. But he had a history of failing auditions. He failed RADA because of his stammer and his nervousness. He went in with a packet of cheese sandwiches that his mother had made for him. He couldn't stop his leg from shaking, so he tried to stop it with the hand that was holding the cheese sandwiches. So the hand started shaking, and in the end, all the judges got showered with grated cheese, and he failed the audition. Then he tried all kinds of things, and he kept failing for radio. Then he went into the forces. He kept going up for these things, and he kept being failed. Eventually, Ian Carmichael, who was working as a young man for Stars in Their Battle Dress, and a man who later became a very important agent called Richard Stone, gave him an audition, and they weren't that impressed again. But eventually they gave him a bit of work. But he was still failing auditions, sadly, but doggedly going on right the way through until after the war, when he finally got in at the BBC.
Mm-hmm. And does that around about 1946? Is that
Yes.
when that comes in? Yeah.
Then of course, after that, he did become really probably the most important British entertainer at entertaining the forces right the way through to the 1980s, when his health was quite poor. He always went to do whatever performances he could for the armed forces, and he travelled all over the world doing it, and he loved it.
That's really interesting. That's just slightly surprised me. I'll just take this question from Karen, who says, Graham, you're clearly extremely knowledgeable about Frankie Howerd. Have you discovered anything new or surprising in the archive that's made you rethink your opinion or view of him?
Well, there's so many things. One thing that really makes the archive valuable is that Frankie Howerd, like so many other performers of his generation, was a master dissembler for various reasons, like his sexuality he had to hide. So he invented all of this kind of fabricated private life, along with an engagement to Joan Greenwood and all kinds of things like that, that you have to separate the fact from fiction. The archive is wonderful for doing that. And he did all of those sorts of things. He also changed his age. He eventually took 7 years off. Most of the obituaries, in fact, continued with that when he died. But he claimed he was born in 1924. He was scared of being dated, like lots of entertainers. He went back. He hid embarrassing or upsetting things in his career, the worst of which was his erstwhile manager, Stanley Dale, a Yorkshireman, sadly enough. He was born near Holmfirth, but a terrible crook who left Frankie Howerd pretty much destitute at the end of the 50s, ran off with most of his money, got up to all kinds of other deeply insalubrious activities. And Howard was so traumatized, he left him out of his autobiography. And so there are so many ellipses like that. And of course, his longtime partner, Dennis Hamer, sadly had to be airbrushed out of that as well. And you can find out all of those things in the archive. Most of those, obviously, as I had the chance to do the biography, I found, but there's more and more details coming out all the time. I'm quite enviously waiting for your next account of the new things that are coming in like that. But I think one thing that you told me the other day, which is potentially fascinating to find out more about, is fan mail, which I got to see a bit, but you've got so much more. And I think it really helps to give this well-rounded view of Howerd. There's so many things have been said about him in certain periods, quite sensationalist, but I think what's often overlooked was he was essentially a very good, very kind, very generous man. He helped so many people. It's a sign of that when he was down in the dumps, writers would just write for him for free. And they wouldn't do that for just about anyone else. It showed the gratitude they felt. And as these letters that you've got in the archive show, he wrote to some people like one-parent families, single mothers bringing up children. He even sent them money to tide them over. He cared that much, and he kept in contact with them. And I think that more and more of that is coming out with these various suitcases and chests that are coming in. And that's really going to add to the whole richness and fascinating quality of his character. So, Karen, I say it's probably fan mail.
Wow, exciting. And yeah, I didn't bring the suitcase up. What a complete mistake. We have got the suitcase, and we've just had the work of a student intern who's been going through to try and find out what the relationship is between the suitcase papers. I'm afraid we've come to a bit of a blank. We just think it might well be his favourite material. But it's really good. It's been a really great adventure seeing someone who's in their late teens, never been around in Frankie Howerd's time, rediscovering the work and actually appreciating it as well. I know some people might think, students might not, but they really did take to him and started taking up all sorts of threads of mystery. Talking of threads of mystery, Amanda's posed a question about Howard's religious perspective. I mean, how much do you think that really did influence his work and performance style and work he took on, or as Amanda puts it, like New Labour, did he not really do religion professionally?
Well, no, he didn't do it professionally. I think he was always careful of not alienating any part of his audience. So he was quite meticulous when it came to that. He edited himself to make sure he pleased as many people and didn't alienate anyone. But in his private life, he really had a big library in terms of books on theology, philosophy. In fact, someone told me when he was in hospital the last time with his last illness, it was one of the few times they went in and he hadn't got his toupee on, which normally he'd always have his toupee on. And he had his glasses on as well. And someone said, "You look just like Isaiah Berlin." And he was hugely proud of that. In fact, I, as an academic, knew Isaiah Berlin, so I went off to Isaiah Berlin and told him this, and he was hugely pleased as well. Said, "What a double act we could have been." So he was an intellectual, a frustrated intellectual, a bit like Kenneth Williams. And he did read theology, and he did have a very strong religious faith, but he kept it separate. as much as he could, but he did. The one time when it did creep in was in that, as I said, that interest in having some kind of religious murder mystery.
Imagine the Father Brown he could have been.
Yes.
I'll just take a couple of questions before I ping my last question back at you, because there's a few people have asked about the archive itself, and it's probably right and proper that I take those questions. A few people have asked about where the archive was before it came to us. It was in various distributed locations. It was in more than one location. The archive is an amalgamation of a couple of bits. Some is agency contracts and correspondence from his agent. The scripts element was from Frankie Howerd Scripts Limited. And in the way that these things do, the trustees began to die out. And in the end, the last trustee was a London solicitor who had a lot of paperwork in his basement, including Frankie's suitcase, and wanted to find a good home for it. So it's a bit of an amalgamation, and some other material came in a few weeks ago that had been held elsewhere. So it's a growing collection. But that's kind of where it was. And no, they weren't really accessible to people at that point either. I think I remember the day I saw the archive for the first time in a very posh boardroom of a very nice London solicitor's office. The scripts just spread out in boxes before me, and unlatching the suitcase was, there are moments in this job, and that was a moment, as was the point it arrived. And actually, I should say a note of thanks to my colleague Laura, who has been helped me lug boxes around and has taken just a deep interest in the stuff as I have, including working with our student intern. In terms of Lyndon Barry, just asked if there are parts of the archive that are at risk of being lost due to previous neglect or damage. Not really. Everything is in really quite good condition. I've seen some archives that aren't in great condition. Some is a little bit bashed, a little bit bent sometimes, but you'd expect that for material of this age. But really, everything's okay. The bits we're going to be a little bit concerned about would be the videotapes. We would like to work on those soon to get those digitised, because they are a media that can be at risk. But the paper stuff is in great condition. Graham, actually, a question back at you. First of two. One thing we've not noticed on the archive that you often get on an archive of someone like this is there's no strong smell of cigarette smoke. Do we take it that Frankie wasn't a smoker?
I don't think he was. I think he had a brief period, but not later on at all, no. He lived with Dennis Hamer, who was very punctilious about protecting his house and hated if Frankie spilt or scarred anything. And so Dennis, Eddie Braben, in fact, told me he went there, he did smoke. He was absentmindedly tapping it into a very expensive Roman urn, which upset Dennis greatly. So they were generally ushered out to the nearby pub. So no, he didn't. He was on his best behaviour.
We can tell that. Sometimes you get a fog of tobacco off these things. And no one better than Frankie to answer the question of what's a Roman urn, obviously. And the last one, from my point of view, of all these things, some things that haven't been seen and never happened. From your point of view, as someone who's deeply immersed himself in Frankie's life and career, which is the one you wished had happened of all these dead ends and things that never came to pass?
Well, I think the Michael Powell, The Tempest, that would have been fascinating. But I think the Holy J.O., I think that was such a passionate project. He really did think, quite often he let writers get on with it, but he was in at the beginning with that and had a creative role in it. And he had a real vision for what it was going to be. And I think it would have suited him.
Brilliant. Oh, there we go. We'll hunt that down in the morning then for you. Graham, that brings to an end. Time really does fly. Our tempers fugit, as they probably say in bits of Pompeii. Graham, I'd just like to thank you so sincerely for your time and your expertise tonight. It's been an absolute treat for everybody, I'm sure. If we were in the room, there'd be a huge round of applause now, I'm sure. But sadly, not possible on Zoom. But you just have to take that as read. Thank you as well to everyone in the audience for coming along tonight. This recording will be available again after this session has finished on the festival YouTube channel, and it will be available from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June, so not too long to wait. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. Very much hope you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Check out the festival website for full details of all the events in the festival programme, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. But for myself here in York with the Frankie Howerd Archive, from Graham, who's been, Graham at home, I assume.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time tonight, and we hope to see as many of you as possible here using the Frankie Howerd Archive in the future and all the adventures to come. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Bye.